I just released my first game, Unfeigned Depths, on Steam, and it took me about 2.5 years to make. But if I was gonna do it again, and I'm gonna, I could have at least cut that time in half with the things that I know now, with a way better result leading up to and after my release. That is what this video is about. These are the lessons that I learned the hard way, so that hopefully you can avoid making these mistakes before it's too late. I am going to skip all the obvious stuff like market better and establish a presence online as soon as possible, since topics like this can be a bit of a dead horse nowadays. This is my generalized advice for specific pitfalls that I experienced while making Unfeigned Depths. I think it should be said that I am a career .NET developer of about 15 years, but I've only worked in enterprise, so never on games before. So although I'm a professional with C#, that was pretty much where my knowledge of game development stopped. So the things I would do differently kind of fall under three categories: story and story development, actual development of the game, and release preparation. So first, writing. I initially started this game as more of an emotional expression, and it was never actually meant to be a full-released, full-fledged game. I never intended for it to be anything noteworthy, but it became that way roughly about 6 to 7 months in. What I did was I split my pretty much 30-ish minute game in half and injected about 60% more content in the middle of it, so where it left off, it would meet up seamlessly. As expected, this broke a lot of things, but more importantly, it started an issue that I wouldn't fully come to realize for another year or so. I had created my game from a story that wasn't written in a way that games are played. It was very abstract, subjective, and linear. The problem with a story like this is that it can be thought-provoking, but lack one thing that games really require: playability. I found myself forcing playability through fragmented and spontaneous ideas, which led me to some of the biggest plagues that I think all creatives can have: scope creep, writer's block, and imposter syndrome. While I was developing Unfeigned Depths, I did what I'm sure a lot of you do. I was constantly writing ideas that I thought would be novel or cool or make a really neat story, except now the benefit that I have is that these ideas can now be filtered through this binary decision of, is it an interactive game or an interactive story at its core? So for example, I'm a horror developer. So whenever I watch certain horror movies or shows like Ouija, Origin of Evil, there's one little scene of one character laying in bed with the other character over top of her. She's whispering in her ear because she's all demonic and possessed and shit. I think that's a great idea, and it's really scary. It's super cool. I'll play a clip from the trailer. That's a really awesome scene, and it's really scary. But this is only scary if you are not directly involved. If you are, say, a viewer, like you are in a movie. It's not scary for literally anybody who is actually involved in this scene. The girl who's on the bed is sleeping, so she's not actually aware. The girl who is possessed and whispering in the sleeping girl's ear, she's possessed. She's probably also not aware. The only person that the fear pertains to is someone who isn't directly involved. So this specific scene would be really difficult to convey the fear to somebody who is actually involved. It's not impossible, but it would take a little bit of a stretch. This has filtered out so many cool ideas that would really only work as written stories or screenplays. It's also really expedited my decision making to whether or not I should even include specific concepts or ideas in a future title, which opens up the doorway for actually valid interactive game ideas. My advice and personal protocol going forward is, when you think of an idea, first and foremost make the objective decision on whether or not it actually has the interactive capacity for a person who is directly involved to have the agency of choice within that story's setting and plot. In addition, another pain point that this caused is that it had me start focusing on things that didn't really matter that much, like the graphical fidelity and the realism of the scene. I noticed this about 1.5 years in, and quickly realized that it was a complete diversion and distraction from the real core of a problem that I had. which was just not writing in an appropriate way for a game. Now for the actual development part. Tons of systems I made should have been implemented very early on in the development of this game. But if you remember my first piece, I didn't really plan for this to become a full-length game. Games require a lot of systems that are self-contained and scalable. 2 years ago, whenever I started this, I would have fully agreed with that. But now I actually understand what that means and how that actually looks, more importantly, when you're making a game. In the beginning, I had virtually no idea of the systems that it actually took to make a game, or the ones that I would need. And I can't really blame myself too much because, well, this is my first game, and all I had was references from other games that I had played previously in the past. But there is a plethora of vital systems that largely go unnoticed by the common gamer. These are systems that I will call invisible systems. They're not invisible because they're just code or whatever. I mean, they're invisible because they're only acknowledged or noticed by the user when they're made badly or something goes wrong. A good friend of mine who was a UI UX designer said to me once, "Good design is invisible." And what that meant was when something is designed well, you don't notice it's there or how easy it is to use. You only notice it when it's bad. You only notice a bad user interface whenever it's clunky and hard to use or it lags a lot. One of the systems that I had to implement that I didn't even know that I needed right off the bat, or that I should have actually implemented it very quickly, was a save system, one of the unsung heroes of all current games. This caused problems for months and was actually one of the last pushes that I made to the release build before publishing on Steam. I always deferred it to another day, thinking like, well, whenever I get to that point, I'll go ahead and implement one. The problem came whenever I needed one, and my game had at this point grown to such a massive scale that it was a nightmare to implement a decent save system. I also made my save system from scratch, so that increased the complexity and a little bit more of the headache. You can go out and get pre-done packages that will do your saving for you, but honestly, I was just a programmer, so I decided to try and do my own. What I learned is that I should have done that as one of the first components and systems of the game. Next is my dialogue system. From the very beginning, what I did know is that I wanted to have voiced dialogue and I wanted to have subtitles to go along with that dialogue in time. I was able to create this pretty easily, and luckily it scaled pretty well whenever I needed to actually extend or adapt it in any way. But some of the unforeseen mechanisms that I actually needed was a queuing system for dialogue so that things can be done in list, or a interruptible dialogue sequence so that a person can stop or can inject things in between sequences of dialogue. These mechanisms were needed around 1.5 years in development, and by that time I had already done a ton of different dialogue sequences. So this really disrupted the entire flow and the implementation of a lot of my components. The next one was level design. Part of this could be remedied by, well, I'm sure you guessed it, good story writing from the beginning. I have 2 scenes in particular that caused me horrible headache. One is a large forest scene that I've got, and 2 was a downtown city scene. With my forest, it was far too large, and I focused on immersion a lot more than I should have. I focused on beauty and forgot to really ask myself, why was I making it the way that I made it? Did I have enough content to actually put in there? Did it follow the story correctly? Well, I didn't know that because my story wasn't written correctly. Next was the city scene. The downtown area was initially the first scene that I ever created, and the first level that I ever created. So it was largely almost a 1-to-1 carbon copy of an asset pack level. I didn't like that from the very beginning, and as development continued, it started to really not match the flow or the style of the entire game after it. So I eventually decided to redo the entire thing from scratch. What I decided to do was this downtown scene, which is a mock-up of my hometown's downtown area. This opened up a pitfall that I didn't realize till 3 months into making this scene. I, much like the forest, started to focus on way too much detail and accuracy and all these things that truly didn't matter that much. I started to focus way more on the way it looked rather than why it existed and what gameplay elements that I could possibly have it contain. So whenever the forest and downtown area is concerned, I felt obligated to now come up with reasons for the player to be there, for things that they can actually do. Admittedly, they're a bit lacking, considering how much work and effort it took to make them. But I think I was actually able to make them work pretty well in the end. This leads to my next point. Detail. What I'm about to say, you should keep in mind for every project going forward. If the player will never see it, don't worry about it. A perfect example is animating. Animating is hard. Animation in general is just hard, especially for somebody like me who's a programmer. Whenever I did my animations, which are a few but not a ton, I forgot to keep the frame of the camera as my frame of reference. I would focus on so many details like the rotation of a knuckle and the placement of the palm or fingertips perfectly on the surface that they're next to, just to be sure that everything was just spot on, only to realize that the entire hand that I was animating wasn't ever even seen by the player. I did this exactly 2 times, and I'll never do animations again without actually having the camera view open at the same time so that I can cross-reference to make sure I'm even doing what I should be doing. In addition, this also applied to specific lighting. Like say if a certain corner of an area is going to be completely pitch black with shadows or something, then there's no reason to add detail or grunge and grime or different litter or any kind of debris. I know it sounds like obvious common sense, but it's not always apparent during the actual creation process. So I would suggest checking your production lights as well while you're animating or creating levels in general. Speaking of lighting, this one is pretty quick, and if I would have just taken the time to do it, the last thing that I mentioned would have never even happened. So I would say choose your lighting fidelity and your lighting settings very early on and stick to those throughout the entire development cycle of your game. Build your levels and scenes with your lighting settings in mind. Be sure to always turn them on and off once in a while to make sure that what you're actually doing can be seen or that it actually looks good. Make sure there's no light leaks or any just strange areas that need to be darkened or lightened up. Next is developer options and functionality. Whenever you're creating something, anything, always keep in mind how you're going to go about debugging that later on. This can be things like teleporting or item spawning, stat differences, even down to the player speed to get through an area quicker. I neglected to do this for a long time, and now looking back, all these little moments where I would have to play through chapters or go through different objectives that might have taken 5 to 10 minutes at a time have probably added up to at least a month of wasted time that I could have been spending developing the game further or getting it ready to release sooner. So basically implement developer tools. You'll thank yourself later. A potentially unforeseen one now is editor versus real game build differences, because they exist. Sometimes things work in the editor of your game engine, but they don't work whenever it's actually been deployed to a user machine. Sometimes things can also work in an actual release build on your development machine, but not work in the exact same build on a completely different machine. So my advice here is build your project and play it as an actual end user pretty often. Even better, if you can do it on a completely separate machine, I would do that. That just takes out a complete different factor. So a good example is this. I have a scene where I've got buoyancy attached to a canoe that the player has to row with. This worked totally fine on my machine, but with one of my playtesters, they started glitching and going crazy all the way through the map in ways that I'd never even seen. Now, the moment that I actually went through the same playtest version end to end, that's whenever I saw it and I could actually fix it. So basically, in-editor game can sometimes be nowhere close to what you can actually experience on a released version of your game. The last big category is for release preparation. From now on, preparing for my release will happen the moment I actually start developing my game, which this means outlining a few things. The method of release. Will you do a public or private beta? At what stages are you going to release versions for your playtesters to play? Are you going to do an early access or a traditional release? Other things like your sales channels. Are you going to be on Steam, itch, GOG, Epic, etc.? What quarter of the year are you going to be releasing? And does it fit the time frame that you're going to need to actually develop your game for that release? So for example, if you're making a horror game, but you won't be finished in time for the spooky season, do you release the game late? Do you completely miss that genre's peak season and release well outside of that season's window? Do you crunch and try to make it happen despite being so short on time? There's a few factors in play that would need to be accounted for, and you can potentially avoid a bad release by taking these into consideration. Lastly, and this one affected me the most and the most recently, playtesting. Early on, start gathering a list of dependable playtesters. As you get playable builds ready, go ahead and ship it to playtesters and let them do their thing. I guarantee you they will find bugs, plot holes, enhancements, whatever that you honestly would have never found yourself. They're good, even if they don't know that they're good. Sometimes not knowing what the hell to do has them do the exact thing you needed them to do. So have a lot of playtesters and have them playtest often. I'll suggest also, you'll probably need a lot more people than you think you do. I had around 15 or so, and honestly, playtesters are humans and adults, and they have lives, so they won't always be available to play your game. And in my experience, some of them won't even log any hours at all. So definitely get a good list of dependable playtesters, and especially ensure they have diverse hardware. In the last 3 weeks before my release, I found a bug that only affected people with AMD CPUs and GPUs, so I had to scramble to find a few playtesters that could play my game that had that kind of setup. Luckily, I was able to figure it out, but it still really sucked. So yeah, honestly, that's a couple of the things that I've really got. I'm sure there's more, and maybe I'll make another list later if I can think of anything. But I just released my game today, so I'm going to take a nap before all the bugs come in. If you haven't yet, like, subscribe, go to Steam, get Unfeigned Depths, or at least wishlist it, or share it with people. I don't know, tell me what you think. If you think it sucks, tell me. I'd love to know. Anyway, thanks.